Good day. Thank you for joining me. I'm doing a study on the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. This is for a project for the Northwest University, second year study on the New Testament. It's a fieldwork project where I've been required to do a socio-historic introduction to a verse from the Bible. The verse I've chosen is Matthew 24 verses 1 to 2, the destruction of the temple and the end of times. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. Do you see all these things? He asked. Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. That was almost unbelievable in those times, to think that such a great building, such a great piece of architecture would be able to be destroyed and removed. But Jesus prophesied it was to come true, and it did. But one needs to first look at how and why this occurred. The destruction of the temple happened in 70 AD. But let us take ourselves back into that time and see what was going on. We're going to look at what is happening in the Roman world, what is happening in the Christian world, and what is happening in the Jewish world. Firstly, let's look at the Christian world. The Christian world had just begun. Jesus had been crucified, he had risen from the dead, and people were converting and flocking to the Christian faith by their thousands. You had the apostles going out and preaching and converting. You had in 33 to 34 AD when Stephen was martyred, you had people dying for the faith of Christianity. You had Peter, the rock upon which Jesus said the church will be built, going to Rome and establishing the headquarters in Rome, the center of the known universe at the time, where all power was concentrated. So there he chose to set up the center of the Catholic Church. You had Paul's conversion experience in about 43 AD on the road to Damascus, and the great influence he had on the growth of the Christian faith, of him going on his missionary journeys, spreading the faith, and spreading the word of Jesus and the word of God. So the Christian faith was growing stronger and stronger. Obviously, the Romans saw this as a threat. And as things moved on, Bishop of Jerusalem was martyred, James, in 62 AD, who had been left to look after the Christian faith in Jerusalem. We had the persecution of the Christians by the Romans after the Great Fire in 64 AD. So the Christian faith had grown and was now under attack. The Romans were in the middle time of their empire. The empire was still growing. They sent out people to go and conquer Britain in 43 AD, as the Roman Empire was still growing. But like all empires and all great empires, there was infighting amongst the leaders. Everyone wanting control. Where there's power, there's greed. And so the Emperor Claudius was poisoned by his wife for her son Nero to take over. And this was the beginning of a lot of infighting within the Roman leadership. So while that was happening, it created a weakness in the Roman Empire. So what happens? 60 AD, Queen Boudicca's revolt in Britain. She spots the weakness and rises against the Romans. The Parthians, that's the people all the way from Afghanistan through Mesopotamia, also noticed the weakness and started to revolt against the Romans. So now Rome is beginning to feel pressure from all sides. There's a great fire in Rome. Rome is burning. And they are under attack. In the meantime, the Jews have stayed true to their faith, stayed in Jerusalem, stayed in Israel, what we call now Israel, in Judea, and were waiting for an opportunity to overthrow their oppressors. So now we're in 66 AD. We have the situation where the Christians have set up their main center in Rome. They have gone out and focused more on the Gentiles, converting them, teaching them about Christianity, spreading the faith through the Gentile world. The Jewish world mainly having rejected the Christian faith and as Jesus as their Messiah. They, the Jews, held on to their own temple worship. They carried on worshipping at the temple, continuing with their rituals, tolerating the Roman occupation, as long as they were left alone and allowed to carry on with their rituals and their temple worship. But Rome was under attack and needed money. So the procurator of Judea, Gaius Florus, needed to raise taxes. They needed money. So they took the occupied territories that they had and went, raided the temple, took money from the temple. They wanted to put up statues in the temple. This was too much for the Jews. And they protested and said, no, you can't. You're our occupier, we'll give to you, we'll pay our taxes, but you cannot enter our temple. That is our sacred ground. Gaius Florus couldn't accept that. He was being asked for more money by Rome. So what does he do? He starts persecuting the Jews. Murdered 3,600 of them, crucifying about 2,000 of them in the May. The Christians, seeing this, fled. They weren't linked to Jerusalem. Jesus was their savior. Their church was not based on the temple. There was no need for them to hang around. The Jews, on the other hand, this was their sacred ground. And this was a bridge too far. They couldn't stand it. They didn't want the Romans to raid their temple. So what do? There's an uprising. The zealots rose against the Roman occupation, and they massacre the Roman garrison that is within Jerusalem. The Romans, in retaliation, in Caesarea, kill 20,000 Jews. The Jewish army rises up and defeats the Roman garrison at Masada, a stronghold, a great fortress. The Jews across the whole of Judea rise up against the occupation of Rome. In Damascus, the Gentiles are massacred, 10,000 Jews. So the Jews are on attack on all fronts, but yet they fight on. And when the Roman general Setius Gallus' army is defeated in November and driven out, Judea is once more controlled by the Jews. They feel they've been saved. They have got rid of the occupier. Rome, on the other hand, was not going to accept this. So what do? They send an army. Like all great powers, they want to quell the rebellion, because if it is seen that they cannot control the occupied territory of Judea, these other fronts in Britain, on the eastern front, will see that Rome can be defeated and opposition to Roman occupation will rise. So Rome has no choice but to quell the rebellion. So they send off General Vespasian and his son Titus across the Euphrates and into Judea with 4 Roman legions to destroy the revolt. And off they go, coming in, taking over the whole of Judea, excepting for Masada and Jerusalem. While on their way, however, there's a delay, because within Rome there is still infighting. within the power system. Nero commits suicide and is succeeded by Galba, Otho, and Vitellius. And finally, General Vespasian returns from this battle, from quelling the Jewish uprising, to go to Rome, and he is made emperor to bring some stability into the Roman state. Now, with the Roman state being stable after all this change in leadership, they go back to taking over and crushing the Jewish rebellion. This is a period of 3 years that this is happening in. So Titus gets given the instruction to continue and to take Jerusalem. On his way, the Roman army destroys Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls are found, which is an interesting study all in itself. But that was a stepping stone on the way to Jerusalem. All of Judea had basically been occupied. The Jewish rebellion in the outlying lands were quelled, and what was left was just Jerusalem. Now, here's a photo of a model of Jerusalem in about 70 AD. One must understand in those times the strength of a city was in its walls and its defense. A well-walled and well-defended city could hold out against very strong armies. There was no gunpowder or cannons or missiles or things to destroy walls. So if you had a good, strong wall, you could prevent yourself from being taken by big armies with even a small force. So you can see here in the model, the walls surrounding the city of Jerusalem gave them a strong standing. Now Titus had an army of about 80,000, and he camped on the mountains overlooking Jerusalem, on the other hills, so he could see, and he decided to create a siege of Jerusalem, realizing that he wouldn't win just by attacking the city. He had to starve the people out, get them to come out of their own accord and try get peace and get their subservience to Rome. Let them swear allegiance to Rome and pay their taxes. That way he will have crushed the uprising. Cleverly, he waited to start the siege after the Passover. The reason why I say that was cleverly is because at the Passover, still being a great feast, hundreds and thousands of Jews came to the temple to celebrate the Passover. So Jerusalem was full to overflowing with people. That would put a strain on the city. More people requiring more food, more water, much more difficult to control. So shortly after the start of the Passover, Titus began the siege, stopping anyone from leaving the city. Anyone who did, he crucified and displayed them for the people in the city to see, so they would know that there was no easy way out. Why had he taken such drastic measures? Well, the Jews left within the city, where the Zealots, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees had different ideas on what to do with this Roman army camped on their doorstep. The Sadducees and the Pharisees were more aligned to negotiating a settlement or coming to some agreement and understanding. So life may continue as it was. They'll continue with their temple worship, and the Romans will get their taxes and, live and let live. The Zealots, however, were having none of this. They had had enough. They had got rid of the Roman army. They had massacred the garrison within Rome, and they were happy that they were now in control, and over their dead body would anyone control Jerusalem other than a Jew. And so it was. What they ended up doing They killed the leaders that were more moderate and put them on display, showing that anyone not prepared to fight would die within Jerusalem. They burnt the food piles of the Sadducees and the Pharisees, creating a greater need for food. They were under siege. They had no way of bringing food in. The piles that they did have would have lasted them a long time. They could have stood a siege for 2 to 3 years. But the zealots, punishing the Sadducees and the Pharisees for not wanting to fight, burnt their food so that they couldn't go into a war of attrition, because they were quite happy to wait it out. We'll just wait until the Romans get tired. The Romans keep fighting in Rome. This army can't stay here forever. They can't afford to siege us forever. They can't breach our walls. So we will just stay here and eat, and eventually we will broker some sort of peace. The zealots saw that this was going to happen, which led them to burning the food supplies. Now there was no choice. If you escaped, you were crucified and displayed. If you stayed, you were going to starve to death if you did not fight. The zealots wanted a fight, and they created the perfect environment where only way of surviving was to fight. This created a scenario where millions of people were to defend the city of Jerusalem. Titus finally won the battle and conquered Jerusalem. They say that originally he wanted to save the temple, but the ferocity of the Jewish defense, when the Romans attacked, led to the burning and ransacking of Jerusalem. The Jews will not accept surrender. They were fought tooth and nail to defend their city. And when the Romans attacked, they attacked the temple as well. And the Jews flocked to the temple when it was on fire to defend it. The temple was burnt in a huge fire, and great number of deaths was recorded at the site of the temple, as the Jews tried valiantly to protect the temple, its artifacts, and its precious gifts, its precious treasures from the Romans. But they did not prevail. It is recorded that about 1 million Jews were killed in this siege of Jerusalem. 70,000 were taken as slaves to build the Colosseum. The great Colosseum in Rome was a byproduct of this raid and the fall of Jerusalem. The money stolen from the temple, the gold recovered, helped pay for the building of the Colosseum. 70,000 slaves were taken to help and build it. This was the end of temple worship for the Jews. Their temple was no more. It had been destroyed. And to this day, it has still not been rebuilt. This victory was so great in the Roman times, they even built the Arch of Titus to celebrate this victory. And on the arch, there are engravings showing the carrying of the possessions of the temple into Rome. The story is that the temple had gold covering on it, and in the fire that burnt the temple, the gold melted and melted to between the stones. And when the Romans were ransacking and taking the treasures, they saw the gold between the stones, and so actually removed the stone from on top of each other to scrape the gold out. In Luke 21, verse 5 to 6, the same story is told. Some of his disciples were remarking how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus said, "As for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down." So one can see that Jesus was right in his prophetic prediction of what would happen to the Temple of Jerusalem. This is the reference list. These are all the articles I've read and studied to help me in the development of this fieldwork project. Thank you for watching.